War pushes invention to extremes, but sometimes those inventions were so reckless, so unstable, that they posed as much danger to the soldiers using them as to the enemy. These weren't just weapons of destruction, they were accidents waiting to happen. From cannons that blew up in their own gunners' faces to suicidal flamethrowers, these are the deadliest military designs that could backfire on their own side. In the 14th century, European armies began experimenting with a terrifying new invention, the bombard. These colossal cannons were among the earliest gunpowder artillery, and to soldiers and citizens of the time, they seemed like something out of a nightmare. A bombard was essentially a massive wrought iron or cast bronze tube, sometimes so large that it took dozens of oxen to transport. The barrel could weigh several tons, and its purpose was simple but brutal: to fire enormous stone balls, each carved by hand, sometimes weighing hundreds of kilograms, straight into enemy walls and fortifications. On the battlefield, the sight alone was meant to inspire fear. Imagine an army dragging forward a weapon as tall as a man, with a mouth wide enough to swallow a person whole. When fired, the roar was deafening, louder than anything most soldiers of the Middle Ages had ever heard. The ground shook, smoke filled the air, and the projectile could smash into the side of a castle wall with devastating force. But there was a fatal problem. Medieval metallurgy simply wasn't ready for the stress of gunpowder explosions. Casting or assembling a cannon barrel that big, without weak points or hidden cracks, was extremely difficult. The thicker and heavier the metal, the more flaws it could conceal, especially in large castings. As a result, many bombards became just as dangerous for their operators as for their enemies. Instead of launching the stone ball forward, the piece might split open like a bursting pipe. Shards of iron or bronze and splinters from the wooden carriage would fly in every direction, turning the gun crew into victims of their own weapon. Entire teams of gunners were sometimes wounded or killed in an instant, not by enemy arrows or fire, but by a catastrophic misfire. Even when the bombard didn't explode outright, it could still cause chaos. Recoil was unpredictable, sometimes powerful enough to jerk the entire piece backward or jump it off its bed. Gun crews typically used a slow match on a long linstock to ignite the powder from a safer distance, but that necessary caution slowed handling and made precise timing difficult in the heat of battle. Few weapons strike fear like fire. From the moment human beings first saw it unleashed in battle, fire became not just a weapon, but a psychological terror. It devoured everything in its path: wood, fabric, flesh, and it left nothing but smoke and ash. For centuries, armies dreamed of harnessing that destructive power in a controlled way. Germany was the first to field the modern flamethrower on a wide scale in the industrial age. During World War I, German engineers introduced the Flammenwerfer to the trenches of Europe. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Soldiers were already used to the deafening thunder of artillery and the choking gas attacks. But to see a stream of liquid fire arch through the air, clinging to walls, sandbags, and human bodies, was something different entirely. It broke morale instantly. But there was a deadly irony. The flamethrower was just as dangerous for its user as for the enemy. Operating one meant strapping a large pressurized tank of flammable liquid, usually a mix of gasoline and thickening agents, later napalm-type gels, directly to your back. In essence, the soldier carrying it became one of the most exposed targets on the field. One bullet, one piece of hot shrapnel, or even a fall at the wrong angle could rupture lines or fittings and ignite the spray, engulfing the operator in flames. The risks didn't stop there. The weapon's ignition system could misfire, or the pilot igniter could blow out, spitting fuel without flame and coating the ground, or the operator's own uniform, in liquid accelerant. In confined spaces, such as bunkers or trenches, the weapon could rapidly consume available oxygen and produce toxic gases, suffocating both the enemy and sometimes the flamethrower crew themselves. Its effectiveness was undeniable, clearing out fortifications, pillboxes, and bunkers in ways that rifles and grenades never could. But the psychological toll on the men who carried it was immense. Flamethrower operators were often singled out by the enemy, targeted first before they could get close enough to unleash their weapon. Many soldiers dreaded being assigned to a flamethrower unit, and some regarded it as a near-suicidal role. Even after World War I, the weapon spread. By World War II, every major army, German, American, Soviet, Japanese, had its own version. The designs improved with better nozzles, more reliable igniters, and thickened fuels to enhance range and adhesion. But the basic problem never went away. The man carrying the weapon was still the most vulnerable figure on the battlefield. In the end, the flamethrower became a symbol of both fear and futility. It was a weapon that terrified enemies, yes, but it also haunted the men ordered to use it. For them, every mission meant wondering if the next burst of fire would consume the enemy or themselves. This grenade was supposed to be an answer to German tanks. In the early years of World War II, Britain desperately needed a way to stop the armored divisions that seemed unstoppable as they rolled across Europe. The solution proposed by British engineers sounded simple: a portable anti-tank grenade that any infantryman could carry. The result was the number 74 ST grenade, better known as the sticky bomb. It looked almost like a glass football, housed inside a removable protective casing, filled with nitroglycerin and coated in a sticky adhesive. The idea was ingenious. A soldier would strip off the outer cover, exposing the glue-covered sphere, and then slap it onto the side of an enemy tank. Once attached, a short delay fuse would begin, and the explosion would cripple or destroy the vehicle. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was one of the most hazardous weapons ever handed to ordinary soldiers. The adhesive itself was unreliable. In hot weather, it became too runny, in cold weather too stiff, and in wet, muddy, dusty, or oily conditions, it often failed completely. Sometimes it wouldn't stick to tank armor at all, sliding right off the steel plating. At other times, it worked far too well. The bomb could attach firmly to the soldier's own battle dress, webbing, or rifle if they weren't careful. There are accounts of soldiers finding themselves quite literally stuck to a live explosive, desperately trying to pry it free before it detonated. The inner glass sphere was another problem. Fragile and difficult to handle, it could crack or shatter if dropped once the protective casing had been removed. Handling such a volatile explosive in the chaos of battle was nerve-wracking enough. Doing it while under fire, with tanks bearing down, was almost suicidal. Because the sticky bomb was so dangerous to its users, training increasingly emphasized throwing it when direct placement wasn't feasible, rather than attempting to stick it to enemy armor at point-blank range. But its range was short, and throwing a heavy, awkward, glue-coated sphere wasn't easy. That meant that in practice, soldiers still had to get dangerously close to enemy tanks, often within just a few meters, to stand a chance of using it effectively. Unsurprisingly, many soldiers distrusted the weapon and preferred alternatives such as the boy's anti-tank rifle, grenades bundled together, or later, the more reliable PIAT launcher. The sticky bomb became infamous among the troops, remembered less as a clever invention and more as a tragic example of desperation in design. More than one unlucky soldier blew themselves up trying to use Britain's solution to the tank problem. In the end, the sticky bomb was a reminder that sometimes the deadliest part of a weapon isn't what it does to the enemy, it's what it does to the men ordered to carry it. Imagine a pistol or carbine-sized cannon that fired small fused grenades. That was the hand mortar, a strange and dangerous experiment in early firearms history. Appearing in Europe during the late 17th and 18th centuries, the hand mortar was essentially a short-barreled large-bore gun with a cup-like or flared muzzle, designed to launch small explosive grenades farther than a soldier could throw them by hand. In theory, this gave infantrymen the ability to hurl explosives over walls, into enemy formations, or into fortified positions without exposing themselves. For commanders searching for new ways to break stalemates on the battlefield, it sounded like an ingenious solution. But the reality was far more terrifying for the men ordered to use it. Early grenades were unpredictable devices, hollow iron or glass spheres filled with powder, lit by a time delay fuse that burned at uncertain speeds. Sometimes the fuse would sputter out before the grenade exploded. Other times it would race too quickly, igniting the charge almost immediately. Soldiers throwing grenades by hand could at least drop them or run if something went wrong. But when a grenade was loaded into a hand mortar, the danger multiplied. If the fuse burned too fast, the grenade might detonate inside the barrel itself, especially if fouling or a poor fit caused it to hang in the bore, turning the weapon into a miniature bomb in the shooter's hands. Even if it cleared the muzzle, a premature explosion could blast the gunner with shrapnel at close range. Contemporary accounts describe accidents in which soldiers were maimed or killed outright, not by enemy fire, but by their own weapon misfiring. Even when the grenade didn't explode prematurely, accuracy was poor. The short barrel and crude ignition methods meant shots often went wild, sending a live grenade tumbling unpredictably across the battlefield. In some cases, the projectile would bounce back toward the very troops who fired it. Using a hand mortar was less like aiming a weapon and more like gambling with one's life. The design saw some experimentation in armies across Europe, but it never became a standard issue weapon. Soldiers distrusted it, commanders found it too dangerous to rely on, and more practical weapons, muskets, cannons, light mortars, and eventually more reliable artillery shells and rifle-launched grenades made it obsolete. In the end, the hand mortar stands as one of history's deadliest miscalculations. A weapon that promised more range and power, but delivered only chaos and risk. For the unlucky men who carried it, battle meant not just facing enemy fire, but wondering whether their own shot would turn into an explosion at their fingertips. In desperation, the Red Army turned to one of the most unusual and tragic anti-tank weapons ever conceived: explosive-laden dogs. The plan was simple in theory and chilling in practice. Dogs were trained to carry packs of explosives strapped to their backs, with detonators fitted to a vertical tilt rod contact fuse protruding upward. The idea was that the animals would crawl under enemy tanks in search of food, and the protruding rod would strike the underside of the vehicle, triggering the mine and destroying both the tank and the dog. On paper, it sounded like an ingenious way to counter the powerful German armor that dominated the Eastern Front. Tanks were nearly unstoppable with small arms, and the Red Army was often short on effective anti-tank weapons during the brutal early stages of the war. If an expendable mobile living mine could cripple or destroy a panzer, it might tip the balance on the battlefield. But the reality was tragic and disastrous. Dogs could not reliably distinguish friend from foe. Many had been trained using stationary Soviet tanks as stand-ins during drills. And in the confusion of combat, with different sounds, smells, and movement, some instinctively ran toward the familiar shapes of Soviet armor rather than German. That meant they sometimes charged back into their own lines, carrying live explosives and detonating among the very soldiers who had released them. There were other flaws. The battlefield was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. Gunfire, explosions, and shouting often panicked the animals, causing them to scatter instead of heading toward enemy tanks. Many were shot by German troops long before they reached their targets, leaving dead animals and unexploded charges scattered across the field. Even when a dog did succeed in reaching a tank, the outcome was unreliable. Some explosives failed to detonate, others damaged tracks and running gear rather than the belly armor, producing only limited effects. The tactic raised moral questions even among hardened soldiers. Using loyal, hungry dogs as disposable weapons was seen by many as cruel and desperate. Soviet propaganda tried to frame the animals as heroes of the motherland, but on the ground, soldiers often viewed the program with unease. For the dogs, there was no choice. Only conditioning, hunger, and a fate sealed the moment they were sent forward. Ultimately, the dog mine project was largely discontinued. While some reports noted damaged tanks from such attacks, The weapon never worked consistently and created as many dangers for Soviet troops as it did for their enemies. It was replaced by more reliable anti-tank methods: conventional mines, shaped charge grenades, artillery, and later dedicated rocket launchers. In the end, the dog mine remains one of the most haunting examples of wartime desperation, a tactic born from necessity but remembered as a grim reminder of how far armies were willing to go, even at the expense of their own soldiers and their own animals. If you had fun watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the next video waiting for you.